Welcome to the 60th Inaugural Ceremonies. The Inaugural Ceremonies are a celebration of the peaceful transition of power, a uniquely American symbol of our constitutional system. It is a joint effort of all three branches of the U.S. government, led by the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies, referred to as the JICH. Although the Constitution specified the oath taken by the President, the framers of the Constitution provided that Congress would determine when and where the inauguration would take place. Since 1901, all inaugural ceremonies at the U.S. Capitol have been organized by the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies. The first 28 inaugurations, however, were planned by the Committee on Arrangements of the United States Senate. The JICH is responsible for planning all inaugural events that occur at the U.S. Capitol. As a joint committee, the JICH is comprised of members from both houses of Congress, one of the unique cases of bicameral involvement in Congress. Members of the committee work across ideological and legislative divisions to host a celebration of our democracy. For the 60th inaugural ceremonies, the JICH is chaired by Senator Amy Klobuchar and includes Senate Democratic Leader Charles E. Schumer, Senator Deb Fischer, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, and House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. The JICH oversees all details of the inaugural ceremonies that happen at the U.S. Capitol. This includes the arrival of the presidential motorcade to the Capitol, the swearing-in ceremonies of the President-elect and Vice President-elect, the departure of the outgoing First Family, if applicable, the presidential signing ceremony, the luncheon in Statuary Hall, and the pass in review. JICH members serve as ceremonial escorts for the President-elect while at the Capitol on Inauguration Day. The JICH works closely with local and national law enforcement to ensure the safety of inaugural guests and spectators. The inaugural ceremonies are comprised of the following 8 events. By tradition, members of the JICH travel to the White House to escort the President-elect, Vice President-elect, and their spouses to the Capitol for the inaugural ceremonies. After a brief meeting, the President-elect and the outgoing President will then proceed together to the Capitol for the swearing-in ceremonies. The Vice President and Vice President-elect will follow, as will family members, cabinet members, and members of the JICH. Since the first inauguration of George Washington in 1789, the procession to the inaugural ceremonies has provided an occasion for much celebration. In 1845, outgoing President John Tyler joined President-elect Polk for the carriage ride to the Capitol, firmly establishing the tradition first carried out by Van Buren and Jackson in 1837. The 1877 inauguration of Rutherford B. Hayes started the tradition of the President-elect going first to the White House to meet the outgoing President before proceeding to the Capitol. The Vice President and Vice President-elect followed in a separate carriage, and after them, members of the Senate Committee on Arrangements. Future inaugurations would follow this precedent. Just before the President-elect takes the oath of office on Inauguration Day, the Vice President-elect will step forward on the inaugural platform and repeat the oath of office. Although the United States Constitution specifically sets forth the oath required by the President, it only says that the Vice President and other government officers should take an oath upholding the Constitution. The present oath, repeated by the Vice President of the United States, senators, representatives, and other government officers, has been in use since 1884. The oath reads, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God." A variety of officials have administered the oath to vice presidents, including the President pro tempore of the Senate, the Chief Justice, the outgoing Vice President, as well as friends and associates chosen by the Vice President-elect. The location of the Vice President's oath-taking ceremony has also changed since John Adams became Vice President in 1789. Until 1937, most vice presidents took the oath of office in the Senate chamber, making it distinct and separate from the president's. When Inauguration Day moved to January 20th in 1937, the vice president's swearing-in ceremony moved from the Senate chamber to the inaugural platform on the Capitol's East Front. Although the vice president's swearing-in ceremony lost some of its distinctness after it moved to the East Front portico, it gained a public audience and reflected the growing political importance of the vice president as part of the executive branch of government. On April 30th, 1789, in front of New York's Federal Hall, our nation's first president, George Washington, took the oath of office on a balcony overlooking Wall Street. With the ceremony complete, the crowd below let out 3 big cheers, and President Washington returned to the Senate chamber to deliver his brief inaugural address. 4 years later, on March 4th, 1793, Washington's second inauguration happened in Philadelphia, where the government had taken up temporary residence while a permanent capital was being built along the Potomac. The president took his oath in a small Senate chamber on the second floor of Congress Hall. In March of 1801, the seat of the U.S. government had moved to Washington, D.C. The streets were muddy, almost impassable, and overgrown with bushes. On March 4th, 1801, President-elect Thomas Jefferson walked with few attendants and little fanfare to the Capitol building from his nearby lodgings at a boarding house to become the first president to be inaugurated in the nation's new capital city. Upon entering the Senate chamber, now the old Supreme Court chamber, Jefferson immediately took the oath of office administered by Chief Justice John Marshall and addressed the audience gathered in the Senate chamber. After his inaugural address, he finished his day with a meal at the boarding house. But for a few occasions, the inauguration ceremonies for all future presidents and vice presidents would take place in the city of Washington. Andrew Jackson's inauguration on March 4th, 1829, was the first of 35 held on the east front of the Capitol, though Jackson's second inauguration in 1833 took place inside the House chamber because of his ill health and bad weather. Presidents from Martin Van Buren in 1837 to Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 were sworn into office on the Capitol's east front. In 1909, a raging blizzard forced William Howard Taft's ceremony indoors to the Senate chamber. Ronald Reagan's 1981 inauguration was the first held on the west front of the Capitol. Seeking to minimize construction costs and improve visibility for a larger number of spectators, Congress shifted the ceremony from its traditional location of the East Front. Although Ronald Reagan's second inauguration on January 21, 1985, was forced indoors to the Capitol Rotunda because of bitterly cold weather, subsequent inaugurations have continued the West Front tradition, including those for George Bush in 1989, Bill Clinton in 93 and 97, George W. Bush in 2001 and 2005, Barack Obama in 2009 and 2013, Donald Trump in 2017, and Joe Biden in 2021. The custom of delivering an address on Inauguration Day started with the very first inauguration, George Washington's, on April 30th, 1789. After taking his oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, Washington proceeded to the Senate chamber, where he read a speech before members of Congress and other dignitaries. At his second inauguration in Philadelphia on March 4th, 1793, Washington gave the shortest inaugural address on record, just 135 words. Every president since Washington has delivered an inaugural address. While many of the early presidents read their addresses before taking the oath, current custom dictates that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court administer the oath first, followed by the president's speech. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address at 8,445 words on March 4th, 1841. John Adams' inaugural address, which totaled 2,308 words, contained the longest sentence at 737 words. In 1921, Warren G. Harding became the first president to to take his oath and deliver his inaugural address through loudspeakers. In 1925, Calvin Coolidge's inaugural address was the first to be broadcast nationally by radio. And in 1949, Harry S. Truman became the first president to deliver his inaugural address over television airwaves. Most presidents use their inaugural address to present their vision of America and to set forth their goals for the nation. Some of the most eloquent and powerful speeches are still quoted today. In 1865, in the waning days of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln stated, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt avowed, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And in 1961, John F. Kennedy declared, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." When applicable, following the swearing-in ceremonies on the west front of the U.S. Capitol, the outgoing president and first lady leave the Capitol to begin their post-presidential lives. Traditionally, the president's departure takes place with little ceremony. In 1797, George Washington attended the inauguration of his successor, John Adams. With few exceptions, subsequent departing presidents followed Washington's example. Until the early 20th century, the departing president also usually accompanied the newly elected president on the carriage ride from the Capitol to the White House following the inauguration. In the early 20th century, a new tradition evolved, whereby the outgoing president quietly left the Capitol immediately following the swearing-in ceremony. In 1909, after congratulating President William Howard Taft, former President Theodore Roosevelt left the Capitol for Union Station, where he took a train to his home in New York. Outgoing Presidents Coolidge and Hoover also left the Capitol for Union Station, where they traveled home by train. Outgoing Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson left the Capitol by car. In recent years, the newly installed president and vice president have escorted their predecessors out of the Capitol after the swearing-in ceremony. The members of the JICH gather on the stairs on the east front of the Capitol building and watch as the new vice president escorts the outgoing vice president and his spouse out of the Capitol through a military cordon. Then the new president escorts the outgoing president and his spouse through the military cordon. Since Gerald Ford's departure in 1977, the former president and first lady have traditionally left the Capitol grounds by helicopter, weather permitting. The first official actions taken by the newly sworn-in President of the United States occur in the President's Room, just off the Senate chamber in the U.S. Capitol. After the departure of the former President and First Lady, the new President gathers there with aides and members of Congress to sign nominations and sometimes memorandums, proclamations, or executive orders. This tradition began in 1981 with President Ronald Reagan. Prior to that time, nominations were often submitted to the Senate on Inauguration Day without ceremony. While the tradition of an inaugural luncheon dates as far back as 1897, when the Senate Committee on Arrangements gave a luncheon for President McKinley and several other guests at the Capitol, it did not begin in its current form until 1953. That year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Mrs. Eisenhower, and 50 other guests of the JICH dined on creamed chicken, baked ham, and potato puffs in the now restored Old Senate Chamber. From the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, presidents left the Capitol after the swearing-in ceremonies and traveled to the White House for a luncheon prepared by the outgoing president and First Lady. In 1949, Secretary of the Senate Leslie Biffle hosted a small lunch for President Truman in his Capitol reception room. They dined on South Carolina turkey, Smithfield ham, potato salad, and pumpkin pie. In 1953, the JICH began its current tradition of hosting a luncheon for the president, vice president, and their spouses, Senate leaders, the JICH members, and other invited guests. At the inaugural luncheon in 1981, newly sworn-in President Ronald Reagan announced the release of 52 American citizens who had been held hostage in Iran for 444 days. The luncheon often features cuisine reflecting the home states of the new president and vice president, or the JICH chairman, as well as the theme of the inauguration. The program includes speeches, gift presentations from the JICH, and toasts to the new administration. After the conclusion of the inaugural ceremonies and the luncheon, the president and vice president traditionally make their way to the East Front steps of the Capitol, where they will review military troops before leading a procession of ceremonial military regiments, citizen groups, marching bands, and floats down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House for the inaugural parade. The inaugural ceremonies may be a routine event, but it remains a unique symbol of our constitutional system. Today, as we celebrate the inauguration of our next President of the United States, we signal to the rest of the world that we are united as a people behind an enduring republic.